Radio TV Phono Nut here, and we have a talking book reproducer, a model that I didn't previously have in my collection and have been looking for one for a long time. Over the years, I've only seen 3 on eBay. One of them was a long time ago, wasn't in the best of shape, and was overpriced. The second one was within the last year. It had been hacked on. Someone had hacked in a new 4-speed drive mechanism, and I think the tone arm had also been replaced. The cabinet was in rather rough shape. It started out at $150, and I think I watched it until it got down to $10, and I actually almost bought it, but I said, no, if I'm gonna buy one, I'd rather hold out and get one that's in decent shape. And somebody eventually bought the hacked up one, so, you know, at least they sold the thing. And then the third one is this model. Now, this one looks to be in above average shape. I think this one's probably been kept indoors. I don't think it's been kept in a storage shed or a basement. And you flip it back, the top back like that, and then the record slides in, and it has wooden guides back here on the back to guide the record. And then this tone arm rest is set up so you can just gently slide the tone arm down the side of the rest, and it will land on the first groove of the record. Now, this is a 33 1/3 RPM only model. That's back when that was the standard speed for talking books. In about 62 or 63, they changed the speed to 16 2/3 RPM, so essentially this machine has been obsolete for close to 60 years, so I doubt the library is missing it. Now, the only thing I question is this tone arm. Even though it's the same color as the tone arm rest, the tone arm really looks like a kiddie record player tone arm that somebody probably replaced. I wished I could remember what the tone arm looked like on the first one of these that I saw on eBay years ago. The one I saw that had been hacked up had one of the wide metal static tone arms on it, which may or may not have been original. I think that type of tone arm would do better than this thing. Even though this is metal, this has a cartridge in it with LP78 flip needle, which you wouldn't need for this type of record player unless you were playing some of the older wide groove talking books, but by the time this was made, they had gone to micro groove. And the needle looks like one of those screw-in set screw things that would be very difficult for someone who is completely blind to replace. Heck, those kind of needles are very difficult for someone who is fully sighted to replace, and most of these machines had needles in them that could easily be replaced by the user. Here's the model tag. This was made by the Pennsylvania Association for the Blind, and based on what I read, everyone who worked in that factory who built these machines, for the exception of the shop foreman, was to some degree blind. Whether they were totally blind or were considered legally blind, which means they have some sight, but their vision is so poor that they're considered legally blind. But like I said, for the exception of the shop foreman, everyone who had a hand in building these machines was blind to some degree. Now let's open this up and see what we have on the inside. And once I get in this, I can probably further tell whether or not this tone arm is a replacement. But yes, I collect these older talking book record players, but getting some of them has been rather challenging and has required a lot of patience, because as you can imagine, even when these were new, these weren't manufactured in the quantities that standard consumer issued record players were manufactured. These were loaned to talking book patrons of the Library of Congress talking book program, and generally when a new machine came out, or when they reduced the record speed to a slower speed and the user would send the old machine back and they'd send him a new one, and the old machine would just get dumped. So pretty much all of these oldies like this have been destroyed. The ones that remain are ones that for whatever reason didn't get sent back, and 50 or 60 years later they're found and got, or it could have been a case where when a new machine became available, whoever had this one might have called them up and told them he was going to send it back, and they might have told him don't bother. I know that's what they did to a friend of mine once they phased out the record players and went with cassettes only. He called them up and was going to send his record player back, and they told him, Mr. Price, don't bother. We've got stacks of them here now that we've got to get rid of, so just don't worry about it, just keep it. Okay, so to open this, we have to remove these two screws on the front, and then the whole mechanism should slide out of the back. Now, as far as post-World War II machines that I don't have, I think there's one numerical model from 1946 that I don't have. I'll have to go look up that model and see which it is, and then once they switch to using letters of the alphabet to designate models, I don't have the models RS, RA. I think pretty much all the rest of them I've acquired. I think I saw one of the Model A's one time, but there again, someone had hacked in a newer 4-speed mechanism and replaced the tone arm with a plastic kitty arm, and I didn't pursue it. Okay, it's coming out. We just had to take a screwdriver and gently push here on the front to kind of slide it back, and then I was able to grab it here on the back side to gently pull it out. And after 60-something years, they get kind of stuck sometimes. Okay, here's the schematic, just a little 3-tube series string amplifier, which is one of the few talking book machines that used a series string amplifier without a power transformer. For the Model C, which looks very similar to this machine, they went back to a power transformer. And I believe I remember reading that the reason they did that is because there were some complaints about this one not being quite powerful enough. And of course there's a safety factor there too. And also I think this was the last model that used octal tubes. After this model they all used miniature tubes. Okay, here's the tone arm. I'm not sure quite what kind of cartridge that is. And yeah, see where that's spliced on right there? This tone arm definitely is a replacement, and I'm going to try to find something more suitable for this. The drive mechanism needs to be redone. The motor mounting grommets are shot. Looks like one of them melted and blobbed up here on this bracket here. Here's the amplifier, 3 tubes, 35 Z5, 50 L6, and 12 SQ7. With lots of paper capacitors, no surprise there. Okay, the speaker looks to have a 1955 date code on it, so that coincides to when these machines were made. Okay, we have this brand new static tone arm, which I think is the closest thing I'm going to have, like what originally was on it, so we'll go ahead and replace that. Okay, doesn't that look more fitting? And of course we know this crystal cartridge is dead, so we'll just replace that with probably an 89T static plug-in cartridge. Okay, I've already replaced the mounting grommets here, here, and here. I took the spindle out, cleaned it, and lubricated it. It turns smoother now. These 3 rubber motor mounting grommets are still in pretty good shape, so we'll leave them alone for now. About ready to take the motor apart, and this is, I don't know who makes this particular motor. I've seen it in some 78 players. I've seen it in a few Kitty 45 RPM phonographs, and I've seen it in a few of these 33 RPM talking book players, but these motors seem to be a little bit difficult to get back together to where they'll run properly and not bind up. You just have to take your time with it. So I'm taking a picture of this for my benefit to know how everything goes back together. We have the top piece here, and then we have the longer of the two spacers on top here, and then the short spacers go on the bottom. Okay, we have the motor cleaned out and re-lubricated, but it's still not turning very freely, so this is where the fun part comes in. We tap on the motor on all sides and tighten down the nuts and check the freeness of the shaft, and tap on it and wiggle it as necessary to get that shaft freed up. It should not be binding on anything whenever we put it all back together. Alright, we're now reassembled and turning freely, and nothing is hitting or rubbing on anything, so that's good. So we're ready to put the motor back in the record player, and that'll take care of that phase of the mechanical overhaul. Then once we get it all back together, we need to clean this shaft of any lubricant that's going to be on it, and get some very fine sandpaper and just give it a very quick touch to this shaft here to get the crud and this old idler wheel rubber build up off of it. That will affect the speed. Okay, for right now we're back together again because it's getting dark and I can't do anything else tonight. It's going to need an idler wheel or an O-ring. If I can find one of those that will work, that will certainly be much cheaper. We're going to have to put a suitable cartridge in this tone arm and adjust the pressure, and then we will see what the amplifier needs. I'm not going to just jump in and full recap the amplifier. I just want to fire it up and just see what kind of operational status it's in currently. And there's really not that many caps involved here. We have the dual section filter capacitor. We have an electrolytic cathode bypass for the output tube and an electrolytic cathode bypass for the driver tube. We have the chassis isolation capacitor. We have the plate, the grid coupling capacitor between the driver and output tube. And we have the capacitor in the tone control circuit, which is a disc. So, like I said, really not that many caps involved here. Alright, if you're wondering what this is about, I'll tell you real quickly what it's about. I can't find any screws long enough to mount this. This is a cartridge that I robbed out of some junk modern record player. I had to use one of the tall mounts to where it would clear the bottom of the tone arm. I do not have any screws long enough. So guess what? It's being held in with masking tape. And as far as the cartridge connections, I've only got one channel hooked up. This is not going to be used for stereo. It's only going to be used for talking book use, and not that much to boot, so it can just stay just like it is. And if you're wondering what this is about, it's because the arm track's too light, and I can't, at least not right now, get the spring to cooperate. So we have this. So we're going to turn it on and see what happens. So it appears that nothing is happening. Alright, I sprayed the controls and the switches sound better now, but we still have no action whatsoever, no motor activity or amplifier action, so we either have a bad switch or switches, or we have a bad power cord. Okay, back on this thing, you're not going to believe this, but not one, but both switches are open. One of them controls the main power to the record player, and the other one is just a motor off-on switch, so the user could pause the record without having the amplifier cool down. And who knows where I could find a couple of pots like this, so I'm probably just going to jump them out. And the way you're going to operate this machine is just simply plug it in and unplug it. And I'll put an inline switch on the power cord if need be. Alright, it's alive, no filter hum. And we have action from the cartridge, so let's go find a talking book and see what happens.
Walden by Henry David Thoreau. Ancient poetry and mythology suggest at least that husbandry was once a sacred art, but it is pursued with irreverent haste and heedlessness by us, our outlook on each other.
it's working, but this really needs a 1.5 volt cartridge. It's just not really loud enough, so I don't know what we're going to do.
Though I value the seed of these beans.
Here's the arm that somebody had on it, and the cartridge that was in here was something they rigged up, and it's dead as a doornail, so I may end up just putting this arm back on there, mounting the 1/2-inch mounting bracket for the cartridge we have, and being done with it. I did some reading about that machine in a book, talking book that I have, about the history of the talking book program, and they mentioned that machine, and they mentioned it went through some refinements. I think it used a couple of different tone arm types. So if we can get this one to work better, we may just put it back on there and be done with it. It really doesn't look that bad on there. Well, I was hoping to compression fit this holder in this tone arm, but it's too wide. I tell you, things are just, nothing's going right today regarding this. Something that should have taken 5 minutes to do is ending up taking me hours to do because I don't have the right stuff on hand. Well, good news, I might have got these switches working. Hosed them down with contact cleaner, worked them back and forth about 5,000 times a piece, and they finally have continuity. That one still seems to maybe be a little flaky, but maybe when we run some current through it, it'll straighten out. Alright, let's move over to the other switch. Well, okay, I'm having to hold this on there. Alright, let's go connect the switches back in circuit, and maybe that little problem is solved. And then we still have to deal with the tone arm. Okay, we have the switches connected back in circuit like they were. All I have to do now is clean up the overspray. So let's see, so we have the drive mechanism taken care of, and in case I forgot to mention, I replaced that idler wheel rubber with an O-ring. That sure beats the cost of a new wheel, or a rebuilt wheel. And we corrected the off-on switches. And we still need to address this tone arm. Astatic made several versions of this tone arm, some with 1/2-inch mount, some with front knob flipper mount, and the 1/2-inch mount ones came in two varieties, the ones with the elevated mounting studs and the one with the lowered mounting studs like this one. And you can see I chipped one of the mounting studs when I was trying to get another screw to fit. Shouldn't have done that, but I think we can still salvage it. And these arms also came with various degrees of tension springs on them. The later versions of this arm that had the lighter weight cartridge had the lighter weight, light duty tension spring. These older ones like this, even though they were made for LP in '78, that used the high mass cartridge, they needed a heavy-duty tension spring in order to get the tracking correctly with that high-mass cartridge. So either we're going to have to change this spring out to something else or hide some kind of weight under the cartridge in this tone arm to where it'll track right. Here's an example of one of those arms with the flip knob mounted cartridge. You can see it has the place where the 1/2-inch mount would have gone, but they never prepared the holes to accept screws. Now this one does track lighter because even with no cartridge, you can see it, tracks heavier. You can see it bottoms out, whereas the other arm we have there stays up in the air with no heavy cartridge in it. So either this spring is lighter duty or the mass of this whole arm is lighter. Okay, I swapped the spring out, which was a bit of a chore. Ended up having to ruin the old spring to get it out. And it's stuff just such as that is why we keep these old junker tone arms on hand, just to get parts off of them. I have not installed the cartridge yet, but I anticipate when I do, it'll track about right. And if it doesn't, we can bend the tab that the spring attaches to compensate for it, but at least it's not sticking up in the air anymore. Okay, we have this bag of old cartridges that a gentleman sent me that he got from somewhere. I'm going to go through them and check them with my AC voltmeter and see if any of them have any output. And if I can find something in here that has output, then maybe I can install it in this tone arm and not have to use that thick mounting bracket, and that way we can use the short screws that held the other cartridge in, and maybe we can get around this problem. Now, this doesn't have to be anything super hi-fi. Like I've said, this is strictly for talking book use, and we don't have to shoot for the moon with this. Okay, here's a sonotone cartridge that looks like it has some output, but you know, the real story will be told once we install it in the tone arm and see how it does in the record player. Well, there's a problem with these short mounting studs on the tone arm. The cartridge won't protrude out the bottom of the tone arm, so scratch that idea. Okay, maybe I should have looked in my cartridge goodie bag that the gentleman sent me first, because there were a couple of screws in there that fit right on in here. So now we have the bracket mounted, and now we'll clip the cartridge in place. I had patched up a couple of places in the speaker, just little hairline fractures that they weren't even broken all the way through yet, but they were pretty close to being busted through, so I went ahead and fixed that. Went ahead and did a quick ohm meter check of all of the resistors. The 150 ohm cathode bias resistor and the 470 k ohm plate load resistor for the driver tube are both a bit out of tolerance, not way out, but enough that they need to be replaced. I will go over these capacitors and check them. I suspect this plate to grid coupling capacitor might be leaky. We'll check that, and I'll check these cathode bypass capacitors and replace as needed. Wouldn't it be something if I didn't replace any capacitors? That ought to make some of the capacitor changer fanatics wet their pants. And it'll certainly be something if I don't have to change this filter capacitor, which, based on the fact that there was no hum in the audio, we might just leave that alone. Now, as far as the audio level, it would get louder and sound a bit more bold if it had an 89T cartridge in it. But the way this tone arm is, I can't put an 89T cartridge in it. The only way I could do that is if I had some spacers and the appropriate long screws, and I know back in the day some of those 89T cartridge holders came with the spacers for mounting in tone arms like this, but I don't have any of those. So we're just going to have to deal with the little modern half-a-volt ceramic cartridge and be done with it. Like I said, this is not something that's going to be used regularly. Now, we may use it from time to time for playing old 33 RPM talking books, but it'll still get loud enough for what we need. Alright, checking capacitors. We're checking the chassis isolation cap. Let's check it for leakage. Okay, that one seems to be a bit leaky at 600 volts. Let's check it against a new capacitor because I know this tester is a little finicky. Yeah, that new one is flashing at about the same consistency as the old one was. So I think that's more of the tester than that capacitor. We are going to have to open this up one day and see about it. Okay, I apologize. I said it was the 470 k ohm plate load resistor. It was actually the grid resistor for the output tube. and before I change that resistor, I'm going to check the DC voltage on the grid end of that coupling cap. It's disconnected, and if I see any voltage there at all, then it's a goner. Okay, on the plate side we have 55 volts, and on the grid side, which is disconnected, we have, it's bouncing around between 0.1 and 0.2 volts. And under 0.1 volts, which really is not that bad, but still we've got a little DC getting through that. So just for good measure, I'll go ahead and change that one. And just for entertainment, let's see what the capacitor tester has to say about it. Remember, it might flash a little bit on the 600 volt rating because this tester, I do believe, has an issue. Yeah, a little flash on the 400 volt scale. Okay, just for fun, we're going to check a new 0.01, which is the value of the old capacitor. Let's kick it up to 400 and see if it flashes at all. And it does not, so that old capacitor was just a little bit leaky, and in the circuit that it's in, we don't need any leakage, so just best to go ahead and replace that. Okay, there's our new cap and resistor soldered in place. Now we need to change this 150 ohm cathode bias resistor, and then I'll check that electrolytic cap while we have it loose. Okay, new cathode bias resistor and bypass capacitor. The old one is a 25 microfarad, reading close to 50, and that's usually an indication of leakage. Alright, let's check it for that. Now we can only do it on this lowest voltage setting here, and as you can see, the light is, well, it didn't stay on very long, so it's not too bad, but I went ahead and replaced it anyway. In comparison to a new cap, let's see how it does. How long does the light stay on? Not long at all, so yeah. Although not too terribly bad, that old cap was a bit on the leaky side. Right, there's the cathode bypass cap for the driver tube replaced. It was also a little bit leaky. Okay, all capacitors changed. I decided to go ahead and change that safety capacitor. Everything except the main filter. Do I leave that in there, or do I leave it in there, or do I replace it? I know if I leave it in there, all of the must change all of the caps crowd will go spastic, so maybe I'll just leave it in there until I have to replace it. I mean, if it shorts, all it's going to do is blow the 35Z5. Alright, there we go, and the main filter cap is still in it, as is the original power cord.
Had shown himself eager to help Thoreau in putting his wares on the Emerson, January 12, 1840.
And like I said, this thing doesn't get as loud as what it would have gotten with the original cartridge, and when you turn the tone control to the treble cut position, that obviously cuts the treble, but consequently also cuts the volume level.
Really responded, I enclose you $25 for your art scenery as promised. I know it is worth,
but it gets loud enough for personal listening, so let's go slam this thing back in the cabinet and call it a day. Alright, here's a book from 1954 that's more age appropriate for this machine, and just some observations. I think our tone arm is still a little bit too light because this likes to skip and get stuck on records, especially they're scratchy and dirty, which most of these are, but I'm not really going to worry about it. That cartridge is probably only going to be temporary until I can find something more suitable with a little bit higher output to stick in that tone arm. So we just move the arm up and gently let it slide down the the guide here.
In the Steps of Jesus by H.V. Morton. Copyright 1934 by Dodd, Mead & Company, Incorporated. Copyright 1953 by H.V. Morton. Recorded in 8 records for the Library of Congress in the studios of the American Printing House for the Blind, 1954. Intended solely for the use of the blind, with the kind permission of the publishers, Dodd, Mead & Company, Incorporated. Read by Andy Chappell. In the Steps of Jesus. Introduction. This book is based on my In the Steps of the Master, and I've prepared it for younger readers. I've done this with great pleasure because I think that a book of this kind would have interested me when I was young and might have helped to answer many of the questions I was in the habit of asking. For something like 1,600 years, pilgrims have been visiting the land in which Jesus was born and in which he died. They have come. In the grayness of the morning, the woman ran back with the message that Christ had risen. The end. Recorded in the Talking Book Studios of the American Printing House for the Blind, Louisville, Kentucky, May 1954. Read by Andy Chappell.